I only meant to rent a boyfriend for one afternoon, but looking back now, I think fate had already signed a contract long before I spent those $200. My name is Emily Carter, and at 24, I had mastered the art of pretending everything was fine. I smiled through awkward family dinners, laughed off every question about my love life, and acted like being the only single cousin at every wedding never bothered me. The truth was much simpler. It did. My younger cousin Olivia was getting married that Saturday, and my mother had already called 3 times reminding me that everyone would be asking why I still came alone. By Thursday night, after another exhausting day teaching second graders, I sat on my tiny apartment couch in Columbus, Ohio, staring at my phone while cold takeout noodles rested untouched on the coffee table. Rain tapped softly against the window, and the yellow glow from the street lamp painted long shadows across my living room. Maybe loneliness wasn't the problem. Maybe I was just tired of defending a life that didn't need defending. That was when my best friend, Chloe, tossed out the most ridiculous idea she'd ever had. Rent a fake boyfriend, she texted. Just for one day. Smile for the pictures. Survive the questions. Go home. I laughed out loud. Then I stopped laughing. 20 minutes later, I was scrolling through a professional companion app that promised respectful, verified social escorts for business events and family gatherings. Most profiles looked rehearsed, almost too polished. Then I found him. Ethan Blackwood. No flashy biography. No expensive photo shoot. Just one simple picture of a tall man wearing a navy sweater, standing beside a lake at sunset with his hands in his pockets. His description was only one sentence. Reliable. Good listener. Comfortable in any room. His rate was exactly $200 for 4 hours. I don't know why I picked him. Maybe because he didn't look like he was trying to impress anyone. Maybe because his quiet smile felt genuine. Maybe because his eyes carried a strange calm I couldn't explain. I sent the request expecting it to sit unanswered until morning. Instead, my phone vibrated less than 30 seconds later. I'll take the job. That was all he wrote. No negotiation. No questions. No conditions. Just 5 words. Something about the speed of his reply made me pause, but I convinced myself he probably needed the money as much as I needed the favor. We agreed to meet Saturday morning at a small coffee shop near the church before driving to the wedding together. After confirming the booking, I closed the app and finally took a bite of my dinner, though I couldn't taste any of it anymore. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the glass like impatient fingers. Somewhere across the city, a man I believed to be a stranger had just accepted $200 to pretend he cared about me for one afternoon. What I didn't know was that my tiny decision had quietly crossed paths with a life hidden behind expensive suits, whispered conversations, and secrets no ordinary teacher was ever supposed to discover. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air and bright blue skies that made the whole city feel lighter than I remembered. I reached the little coffee shop 15 minutes early because being late always made me nervous. The sidewalk smelled like fresh espresso and cinnamon pastries, and people hurried past carrying paper cups while golden leaves drifted across the street. I checked my reflection in the window for what had to be the 10th time, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my navy dress and wondering if this entire plan had been a terrible mistake. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bell above the cafe door chimed. I looked up, expecting someone overly confident or awkwardly rehearsed. Instead, I saw him. Ethan Blackwood walked inside wearing dark jeans, a charcoal jacket, and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet somehow every conversation around us seemed to soften for a brief moment. He carried himself with an effortless calm that made the crowded room feel strangely quiet. When his eyes found mine, he smiled with the same reserved warmth from his profile picture. "Emily," he asked. His voice was low and steady. "I hope I did not keep you waiting." "Not at all," I answered, standing a little too quickly and nearly knocking over my coffee. He caught the paper cup before it tipped, placing it back on the table with gentle precision. "Nice save," I laughed nervously. Occupational habit, he replied with a faint smile that never quite revealed what he was thinking. We ordered coffee and sat near the front window. I expected awkward introductions, but conversation flowed surprisingly easily. He asked about my students, remembered every detail I mentioned, and listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like my stories actually mattered. When I apologized for talking too much about teaching, he simply shook his head. People who care about others usually underestimate how interesting they are. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. As we reviewed the simple story we planned to tell my family, I noticed he never needed to check his phone. He remembered every name I mentioned after hearing it only once. My parents. My cousins. Even my grandmother's habit of offering homemade pie to every guest. You have an impressive memory, I said. It helps to pay attention, he answered. Before we left, he opened the cafe door and stepped aside so I could walk through first. It was a small gesture, but somehow it felt completely natural. Outside, the parking lot shimmered beneath the morning sun. I unlocked my aging silver Honda Civic and immediately felt embarrassed beside his quiet confidence. We can take my car, I offered. Ethan glanced toward the opposite end of the parking lot. For just a second, something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Awareness. His eyes lingered on a black sport utility vehicle parked beneath a maple tree. It looked ordinary enough, but the driver lowered his newspaper the instant Ethan looked over. Ethan gave the slightest nod, almost impossible to notice, and the newspaper lifted again. Is everything all right? I asked. His attention returned to me so smoothly that I wondered if I had imagined the entire moment. Everything is fine, he said with an easy smile. Lead the way. I climbed into the driver's seat while he settled beside me, calm as ever. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of the black vehicle in my rearview mirror. It pulled away from the curb a few seconds after we did, keeping several car lengths behind us. I assumed it was only another driver heading toward the highway. I had no reason to think otherwise. At that moment, I still believed the man sitting beside me was simply the best $200 I had ever spent. The church stood on a gentle hill overlooking rows of orange and crimson maple trees, and by the time we pulled into the parking lot, every space seemed filled with smiling families dressed in their Sunday best. My stomach tightened the moment I recognized my parents waving from the front entrance. Remember, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel for one extra second, we met through a mutual friend about 4 months ago. Ethan looked at me with complete confidence. For months. Your favorite coffee is caramel with oat milk. You teach 2nd grade. Your grandmother always pretends she does not need help carrying dessert even though she always does. I think I can manage. I laughed despite my nerves. You memorized everything. You trusted me with your story, he replied. The least I could do was remember it. We walked toward the church together, and before I realized what he was doing, Ethan offered me his arm with such natural ease that I accepted without thinking. My mother noticed first. Her eyes widened just enough to tell me she had already approved of him before he even introduced himself. My father shook Ethan's hand firmly, studying him with the quiet suspicion every father seemed to reserve for the men around his daughter. Ethan never appeared uncomfortable. He answered every question respectfully without sounding rehearsed, and somehow he managed to make my father laugh within 5 minutes. I had spent years trying to accomplish that. Inside the reception hall, the afternoon unfolded more smoothly than I ever imagined. Ethan danced exactly once because my grandmother insisted, complimented my mother's homemade pie before tasting it, and somehow remembered the names of cousins I barely saw once a year. Watching him move through the room felt like watching someone who had practiced every social situation imaginable. He never tried to become the center of attention. Instead, he made everyone else feel important. That was what impressed me most. During dinner, my cousin leaned over and whispered, "Emily, where have you been hiding this guy?" I nearly laughed into my glass of iced tea. Pure luck, I answered. The words felt strangely true. Later that afternoon, while everyone gathered outside for photographs beneath a large oak tree, I noticed something odd. 3 men wearing dark suits stood near the edge of the parking lot. They looked too formally dressed for a country wedding, and none of them seemed interested in the ceremony. Instead, every few minutes, one of them glanced toward Ethan before quietly looking away again. I assumed they were guests from the groom's side until another black sport utility vehicle rolled into the lot. A 4th man stepped out carrying what looked like a leather portfolio. He walked toward the others, spoke briefly, then stopped the instant Ethan casually looked in their direction. Without a single word, the man turned around, returned to the vehicle, and drove away. "Do you know those people?" I asked as we waited for the photographer to arrange the families. Ethan followed my gaze for less than a second before answering. "No. They are probably here for another event nearby." His voice sounded perfectly calm, yet something about his eyes became harder to read. Before I could ask another question, my little niece ran over and grabbed Ethan's hand. "Come stand next to Emily," she said excitedly. "You look like you belong together." Ethan smiled softly and let the little girl pull him into place beside me. The photographer lifted his camera and counted to 3. Just before the shutter clicked, I caught another glimpse of the men in dark suits. All of them were watching us, but the moment Ethan turned his head ever so slightly, they immediately looked away as though they had been reminded of an invisible rule that only they understood. The reception slowly settled into the comfortable rhythm that always followed a wedding ceremony. Children chased one another. Across the lawn, older relatives argued playfully over family recipes, and soft music drifted from hidden speakers beneath the white canopy. For the first time in weeks, I felt my shoulders relax. Maybe Chloe had been right. Maybe this ridiculous plan had actually saved my weekend. Ethan stood beside me near the refreshment table, quietly pouring lemonade into 2 glasses before handing one to me without asking. "You looked like you needed a break," he said. "You are surprisingly good at reading people," I admitted. A faint smile crossed his face. "Sometimes people tell you everything without saying a word." Before I could answer, an older man in an expensive grey suit approached us from across the garden. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his silver hair neatly combed despite the afternoon breeze. I assumed he was another wedding guest until I noticed something unusual. The moment he reached us, his eyes went directly to Ethan instead of introducing himself. "Beautiful afternoon," the man said pleasantly. "It is better than yesterday's forecast." Ethan gave the smallest nod. "Weather changes quickly." Their exchange lasted only seconds, sounding completely ordinary to anyone nearby, yet something about it felt rehearsed. The older man smiled politely at me before extending his hand. "You must be Emily. It is a pleasure to meet you." "Likewise," I replied. "Are you with Olivia's family?" "Not exactly," he answered before turning back toward Ethan. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he said one word that made my attention sharpen. "Boss." He stopped himself immediately. "I mean, sir." I almost forgot myself. An awkward silence hung in the air for a heartbeat. Ethan's expression never changed. "Easy mistake," he answered calmly. "Enjoy the afternoon." The older man inclined his head with remarkable respect before quietly walking away. I stared after him until he disappeared into the crowd. "Did he just call you boss?" I asked with a laugh, expecting Ethan to laugh too. Instead, he took a slow sip of lemonade before answering. "Years ago I managed a logistics company. Some former employees still use old habits." "That explains the suits," I asked, glancing toward the edge of the property where the same group of sharply dressed men remained scattered near different vehicles. Ethan followed my eyes for only an instant. "Corporate people rarely know how to dress casually." His answer sounded reasonable enough, yet it somehow explained nothing. Throughout the next hour I kept noticing little things that refused to fit together. Every time Ethan walked across the lawn, someone seemed to open a door before he reached it. Whenever he entered a conversation, strangers instinctively stepped aside to make room. Restaurant staff thanked him before he even spoke, although I never saw him ask for anything. It was subtle, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once I noticed it. Late in the afternoon, my father asked Ethan if he could help carry several folding chairs back into the reception hall. Ethan immediately agreed. I watched from across the lawn as he effortlessly stacked the chairs with my father while listening more than speaking. Whatever mystery surrounded him, his kindness never felt manufactured. That confused me more than anything else. As the sun began sinking behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of gold and amber, my phone buzzed with a notification from the companion application confirming that our 4-hour reservation would end in 30 minutes. I looked up from the screen toward Ethan, who was laughing softly at something my grandmother had just said. For reasons I could not explain, I suddenly felt disappointed that our agreement was almost over. At that exact moment, one of the men in the dark suits walked briskly toward Ethan, stopped several feet away, and waited silently without interrupting. Ethan excused himself from my family and stepped aside. The man leaned forward just enough to whisper something into his ear. I could not hear the words, but I saw Ethan's warm smile disappear for the first time that day. The drive home felt quieter than the drive to the wedding. The late afternoon sun stretched across the highway, turning the fields outside my window into ribbons of gold, while the soft hum of my old Honda filled the silence between us. Ethan looked out the passenger window, calm. Again, as though whatever message he had received had already been carefully tucked away behind that unreadable expression. I wanted to ask him about the man who had whispered in his ear, about the strange respect everyone seemed to show him, about the word that had slipped out so naturally earlier that afternoon. Instead, I asked the safest question I could think of. Did you enjoy pretending to be my boyfriend? He turned toward me with a smile that felt genuine. I did not have to pretend to enjoy spending time with you. My heart stumbled for reasons I refused to examine too closely. We reached the coffee shop parking lot just before sunset, the exact place where our agreement had begun only hours earlier. I parked beside the sidewalk and reached into my purse for the envelope holding his payment. "Thank you," I said, handing it to him. "You made today easier than I imagined." Ethan accepted the envelope but did not open it. "You gave me an interesting day as well." We stood beside my car for a moment, neither of us seeming eager to leave. Finally I laughed softly. "Well, I guess this is goodbye." "Perhaps," he answered, though something in his voice made the word sound uncertain. We shook hands, and then he walked toward the opposite end of the parking lot where I expected him to disappear into another ordinary car. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until he was several yards away before quietly stepping behind my vehicle. Ethan stopped near the same black sport utility vehicle I had noticed that morning. Before he reached it, 4 men stepped out almost simultaneously. None of them spoke right away. One opened the rear passenger door. Another handed Ethan what looked like a slim tablet. A third stood nearby, scanning the nearly empty parking lot with practiced attention. Then something happened that made every explanation I had accepted throughout the day collapse in an instant. All 4 men lowered their heads toward Ethan with unmistakable respect before one of them spoke. I could not hear every word from where I stood, but I heard enough. "Everything is secure, boss." The word carried clearly through the cool evening air. Boss. Not sir. Not Mr. Boss. Ethan glanced briefly toward my car. For one terrifying second I thought he had seen me hiding there. Instead, he answered quietly, and although I could not make out every sentence, his tone was calm, controlled, and effortlessly authoritative. The men listened without interrupting. Nobody questioned him. Nobody offered suggestions. They simply nodded as though his decisions ended every discussion. My pulse pounded so loudly that I barely noticed the black luxury sedan pulling into the lot. It stopped beside the sport utility vehicle, and another sharply dressed man stepped out carrying a leather folder. He handed it directly to Ethan with both hands before stepping back. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and typed the only thing I could think of into the search bar. Ethan Blackwood. Nothing. No social media. No business profile. No interviews. Almost nothing at all. Then, beneath the ordinary search results, one article from nearly 2 years earlier caught my attention. It was about an anonymous businessman whom reporters had nicknamed the Hidden King because no verified photograph of him had ever existed. The article described a mysterious figure connected to a vast network of luxury hotels, shipping companies, investment firms, and private charities. Witnesses all described the same thing: quiet, private, impossible to photograph, surrounded by loyal associates who referred to him only as boss. I slowly lifted my eyes from the screen and looked across the parking lot. Ethan was climbing into the waiting vehicle with the same composed smile he had worn while talking to my grandmother just an hour before. In that moment I realized the man I had trusted with my family's happiness for one afternoon had never been an ordinary stranger at all. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image repeating itself like a scene from a movie. For impeccably dressed men lowering their heads toward Ethan before calling him boss. By Monday morning, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the article was exaggerated. Maybe he really did own a successful company, and people simply admired him. The internet loved turning wealthy people into legends. That had to be it. I buried myself in work, hoping 20 energetic second graders would erase the question spinning through my mind. They almost succeeded. Finger painting, spelling quizzes, and helping one little boy tie his shoes reminded me that my real world was wonderfully ordinary. Yet every time my phone vibrated, my heart jumped before I even looked at the screen. Around 3:30 that afternoon, after the last student had been picked up, I gathered papers from my desk and walked toward the faculty parking lot. The October breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the school grounds had become almost silent. That was when I noticed the familiar black sport utility vehicle parked across the street. My steps slowed. It could not possibly be the same one. Hundreds of people owned black vehicles. I told myself not to be ridiculous. I unlocked my Honda, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Before I shifted into reverse, someone tapped lightly on the driver's side window. I turned so quickly that my keys slipped from my hand. Ethan stood outside wearing a dark overcoat, one hand tucked casually into his pocket, looking exactly as composed as he had at the wedding. He smiled politely when I lowered the window a few inches. "Good afternoon, Emily. What are you doing here?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. I wanted to return something. He held out the sealed envelope containing the $200 I had paid him. I stared at it without reaching for it. "The agreement ended yesterday." "Exactly," he answered. "Which is why I cannot accept payment anymore." "You earned it." He shook his head gently. "I accepted your request because I wanted a quiet afternoon away from my usual responsibilities. You gave me that. Consider us even." I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "Who are you really, Ethan?" His smile faded into thoughtful silence. Cars passed on the street behind him, their reflection sliding across the polished surface of the black vehicle waiting nearby. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he rested one hand lightly against the edge of my open window. "I am someone whose life is often more complicated than it appears. People called you boss." His eyes met mine without hesitation. "They work with me." The article I found described someone who hides behind businesses and charities. He remained calm. Articles often describe things they do not fully understand. So it was true. He let out a quiet breath. Parts of it. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I realized I was no longer frightened. Confused, yes. Curious, absolutely. But the man standing beside my car was still the same person who had listened patiently to stories about my students, danced with my grandmother, and carried folding chairs without being asked. Finally, I accepted the envelope, but instead of placing it in my purse, I set it on the dashboard between us. "I think it is better if we both move on," I said softly. Ethan nodded once. That would probably be the safest decision. He stepped back from the window, giving me enough room to pull away. I shifted the car into reverse, but before I could leave, a silver sedan rolled slowly past the school entrance for the second time in less than a minute. Ethan's relaxed expression changed almost imperceptibly. His eyes followed the vehicle until it disappeared around the corner, and when he looked back at me, his voice was calm but carried a quiet urgency I had never heard before. "Emily," he said, "if anything unusual happens over the next few days, promise me you will answer my call." For the next 3 days, I kept telling myself that Ethan had simply been overly cautious. Nothing unusual happened. I taught my classes, graded spelling tests, stopped by the grocery store on Wednesday evening, and almost convinced myself that our strange weekend belonged in the past. Then Thursday arrived. School ended just after 3 o'clock, and I stayed behind to decorate the classroom for the fall reading festival. By the time I finally carried the last stack of construction paper to my car, the parking lot was nearly empty. The sky had turned a soft grey, and a cool breeze carried dry leaves across the pavement. I unlocked my Honda and reached for the driver's door when I noticed a cream-colored envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. There was no stamp. No address. Just my first name written neatly across the front. Emily. My heartbeat quickened as I opened it. Inside was a single blank sheet of paper except for one sentence typed across the center. "Stay away from the man you met at the wedding." I looked around the parking lot. There was nobody nearby except a custodian locking the gymnasium doors. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was some childish prank, but the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. I climbed into my car, placed the note on the passenger seat, and started driving home. At the third traffic light, I glanced into my rearview mirror and noticed the same silver sedan Ethan had watched outside the school earlier that week. Maybe it was coincidence. I turned right instead of left. The sedan turned too. I drove through a neighborhood filled with small brick houses and maple trees blazing with autumn colors. The sedan remained several car lengths behind me. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Ethan's words echoed in my mind. "If anything unusual happens, promise me you will answer my call." As though my thoughts had summoned it, my phone lit up through the Bluetooth display. "Ethan Blackwood." I answered immediately. "Ethan. Where are you?" His voice was calm, but every word came with careful precision. I told him my location. "Do not drive home," he said. "Stay on the main roads. Keep moving. I will meet you. Someone has been following me." "I know." Before I could ask how, he continued. "You are not in danger if you stay exactly where other people are. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good. Trust me for 5 more minutes." The call ended. I followed the busy boulevard toward downtown, passing restaurants, gas stations, and crowded intersections. 2 minutes later, I saw 3 black sport utility vehicles merge smoothly onto the road ahead of me while another pulled in several car lengths behind the silver sedan. Everything happened so naturally that most drivers probably never noticed. Traffic continued flowing. Nobody honked. Nobody panicked. Yet somehow the silver sedan quietly changed lanes at the next intersection before taking the first available exit. It disappeared without another glance. Moments later, Ethan's black vehicle pulled alongside mine while we waited at a red light. He lowered his passenger window just enough for me to see him. "Are you all right?" he asked. I nodded, still trying to steady my breathing. "What just happened?" The traffic light turned green, but neither of us accelerated immediately. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Someone wanted to know whether you still mattered to me." "And do I?" For the first time since I had met him, Ethan answered without hesitation. "More than I ever intended." As the light changed and traffic began moving again, I noticed something I had completely missed before. Every black vehicle around us adjusted its speed at exactly the same moment, forming a quiet circle that surrounded my little Honda without drawing attention from anyone else. They were not trapping me. They were protecting me. And every driver inside those vehicles seemed to be waiting for only one person's decision. That evening, Ethan asked me to follow his vehicle instead of driving home alone. 20 minutes later, we arrived at a quiet estate tucked behind towering oak trees on the edge of the city. It was elegant without being extravagant, surrounded by carefully kept gardens instead of towering gates that screamed for attention. As I stepped out of my car, the same men I had seen throughout the week greeted Ethan with respectful nods before returning to their positions without a single unnecessary word. Nobody stared at me. Nobody questioned why I was there. They simply treated my presence as though it had already been expected. Ethan led me onto a wide stone terrace overlooking a small lake where the last light of sunset shimmered across the water. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Finally, I turned toward him. "You said someone wanted to know whether I mattered to you. Why would anyone care?" Ethan rested both hands lightly against the terrace railing before answering. "Because people often look for weaknesses in powerful lives. Sometimes they search for money. Sometimes influence. Sometimes relationships. Am I one of those relationships?" He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "You became one much faster than I intended." I looked across the lake, trying to understand how my ordinary life had become connected to his extraordinary one. "You still have not told me why you accepted my request." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "The truth is simpler than you probably imagine." He glanced toward the water before continuing. "The morning I saw your request, I had decided to disappear from my public life for one weekend. No meetings. No business. No responsibilities. Then your message appeared. Out of thousands of requests. I asked." He nodded. Something about it felt honest. "You were not looking for money or status. You simply wanted one peaceful afternoon with your family." I laughed softly. "It was probably the most desperate decision I have ever made. It became one of the best decisions I have made." His words settled gently between us. There was no dramatic declaration, no rehearsed romance, only quiet sincerity that somehow felt more powerful. I studied his face in the fading sunlight and realized something that surprised me. Every frightening story I had imagined about Ethan came from strangers. Everything I actually knew about him came from my own experience. He had been patient with children, respectful to my parents, kind to my grandmother, honest when he could be, and careful whenever my safety became part of the conversation. "You could have lied," I said. "You could have invented another story." Ethan looked directly into my eyes. "I have spent enough of my life hiding behind titles and assumptions. I never wanted to hide from you." The cool evening breeze lifted a few strands of my hair across my face. Before I could brush them away, Ethan paused, silently asking permission with nothing more than his expression. When I gave the smallest nod, he gently tucked the loose strands behind my ear before immediately lowering his hand again. The gesture lasted only a second, yet somehow carried more meaning than anything else that had happened between us. My phone buzzed inside my purse, startling us both. It was my mother checking whether I had made it home safely. I smiled and quickly sent back a reassuring reply. When I looked up again, Ethan was watching me with quiet admiration. "You always answer your family right away," he observed. "Family should never wonder if someone they love is safe." He nodded thoughtfully. "I hope one day someone says the same thing about me." For the first time since we met, I realized the powerful man standing before me was not searching for someone to admire his world. He was searching for someone who could remind him what an ordinary, peaceful life was supposed to feel like. The following Saturday, exactly 1 week after our impossible agreement had begun, I found myself standing outside the same little coffee shop where everything had started. The morning air carried the familiar scent of roasted coffee and fresh pastries, and sunlight spilled across the sidewalk as if the city had quietly decided to give us another chance. I was the one who had sent the message this time. No contract. No conditions. Just one simple question asking if he had time for coffee. Ethan arrived wearing another simple sweater instead of the tailored suits I had grown used to seeing around him. He looked less like a powerful businessman and more like the quiet stranger I had chosen from a screen only days before. When he sat across from me, neither of us rushed to speak. Somehow silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. I reached into my purse and carefully placed the unopened envelope containing the $200 between us. Ethan glanced down at it before looking back at me. "I thought we settled this," he said with a gentle smile. "We did," I replied. "That is why I am giving it back." He looked genuinely confused. "You paid me fairly." I slowly pushed the envelope toward him. "This is not payment anymore." He remained perfectly still, waiting for me to finish. "Last week I hired someone to pretend to be my boyfriend because I was afraid of facing my family alone. The man who showed up did much more than that. He reminded me that kindness does not always arrive the way we expect. He listened to my stories. He respected the people I love. He protected my peace before I even understood I needed it." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, almost as though praise made him more uncomfortable than responsibility ever could. "Emily." I smiled and gently rested my fingertips on top of the envelope. "If I leave this with you today, it is not because I owe you anything." I took a slow breath before saying the words that had quietly formed in my heart over the past week. "It is because I would rather spend time with the real Ethan than the one I rented." For the first time since I met him, he laughed without restraint. It was warm, genuine, and wonderfully ordinary. He picked up the envelope, looked at it for a second, then placed it back in front of me. "Then allow me to make one small change." I raised an eyebrow. "What change?" "The contract ended the moment you became someone I wanted to know outside of it." He stood, walked around the table, and offered his hand exactly as he had outside the wedding church. "May I take you to lunch?" No agreement. No schedule. No pretending. I slipped the envelope back into my purse and accepted his hand with a smile that felt lighter than any I could remember. As we stepped outside together, I noticed one of the familiar black sport utility vehicles parked discreetly across the street. This time, instead of feeling intimidated, I simply smiled when I saw one of the drivers respectfully look away to give us privacy. Ethan noticed my expression and quietly asked, "What is so funny?" I glanced up at the clear blue sky before answering. "I spent $200 trying to rent a perfect afternoon." I looked back at him and smiled. "Instead, I accidentally found someone real." He squeezed my hand gently as we walked toward the restaurant waiting around the corner, and for the first time since this unbelievable story began, the future no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt open. Looking back now, I finally understand that fate rarely knocks on the front door. Sometimes it quietly accepts a simple invitation, sits across from you with a cup of coffee, and changes your life without ever asking for permission.